posted on YouTube and linked on our website for those who missed the session or if you would like to watch it again.
Si necesita ayuda en español, por favor envíe un correo electrónico a studentassignment@wcpss.net y alguien se comunicará con usted mañana.
This evening's session will focus on reviewing final recommendations on calendar changes for Heritage Elementary, Heritage Middle, Holly Grove Elementary, Holly Grove Middle, Holly Springs Elementary, Rex Road Elementary, Pleasant Grove Elementary, and Sycamore Creek Elementary. Today's session was prepared by the Long Range Planning Department and the Office of Student Assignments. And the information we will review with you this evening is a subset of the full presentation that was shared with the board at their work session on May 5th. Again, this evening's session will focus on Heritage Elementary, Heritage Middle, Holly Grove Elementary, Holly Grove Middle, Holly Springs Elementary, Pleasant Grove Elementary, Rex Road Elementary, Sycamore Creek Elementary, and we do want to make note that Briar Creek, Carpenter, and Morrisville are no longer under consideration for a calendar change in this planning cycle. Before we begin, let's go over some logistics. Our session will last approximately an hour and a half. We will begin with a presentation and conclude by responding to questions from today's session. We recognize that now and throughout the session, you may have questions about the process or the impact of a calendar change at your school. To capture your questions, we will be using the Q&A feature within Google Meet. And to access this feature from a computer, please click on the grid shape in the toolbar on your screen. If you're using a mobile device, select the three dots first, then select the icon with three shapes. You should then see a Q&A feature identified by a question mark. To ensure questions are anonymous, our moderators will be monitoring the Q&A for questions and capturing them throughout the evening's session. Once you see that your question has been removed from the Q&A, your question has been successfully captured by the moderators. You do not need to resubmit your question. We will make every effort to respond to your questions toward the end of the session. And in addition, we will use questions to update the FAQ portion of our website.
Si necesita ayuda en español, por favor envíe un correo electrónico a studentassignment@wcpss.net y alguien se comunicará con usted mañana.
In addition, we are asking that you contribute to the community discussion on calendar changes via Thought Exchange. The link is shown on the screen and will remain open through tonight, May 13th. Midnight tonight, it will close, and then we will summarize the feedback received and share with the board during their work session next week on May 19th. No one will be personally identified in the summary. Before I turn things over to Susan, I'd like to remind you that today's session will focus on Heritage Elementary, Heritage Middle, Holly Grove Elementary, Holly Grove Middle, Holly Springs Elementary, Rex Road Elementary, Pleasant Grove Elementary, and Sycamore Creek Elementary. By the end of this evening's session, you will have had an opportunity to review feedback captured during recent public engagement activities, review recommendations for school calendar conversions, review next steps in the process, and submit questions to gain a better understanding of the potential impacts of a calendar change for your school. And now I will turn things over to Susan.
Melissa, thank you so much for welcoming everyone, and to all of you joining us tonight. Thank you for giving us some of your precious time. As Melissa welcomed us, she reminded us how beautiful it is outside. So we do appreciate you giving us this time when you could potentially be enjoying some beautiful spring weather. As a reminder, before we get into tonight's discussion, all the information that we're sharing with you can be found on our assignment planning website by clicking on step 6, or alternatively going directly to that page, which is known as our calendar conversion page. So please feel free to visit this website for additional information beyond what is being shared tonight, as well as for more information about how we've gotten to this point in the process. Melissa did remind you, and I'll just remind you again, that in order to submit a question for tonight's session, please post your questions using the Q&A features here in the Google Meet. You'll use the toolbar on your computer, look for the grid shape on the bottom. If you're using a mobile device, look for those 3 dots, then look for a series of shapes that it's like a circle, triangle, square. Ultimately, what you're working on is getting to this question mark feature. We are going to make sure that all of your questions are anonymous. So when you see that your question has been removed from the Q&A feature, that lets you know that our moderators have successfully captured your question, and we'll get to it towards the end of tonight. This is not a public hearing, so we will not be taking any formal public comments. This is just an information session, but please do make sure you provide us with detailed questions. And if you have a very specific question to your own person or student, we may be able to follow up with you using email from one of our staff members tomorrow. Again, our thought exchange has been open for quite some time. It's going to close tonight right before midnight. So if you do have additional thoughts that you'd like for the board or the planning team to review and consider before any final recommendations or decisions are made, please take an opportunity to put those comments there. The benefit of the thought exchange is that the board can see all of the comments, staff can see all of the comments, and a full summary of all of the information that's being shared will be available to the board at their May 19th work session. So before we dive into the specific recommendations, I just want to go over some of the feedback we collected since the initial discussion began. So early in March, or excuse me, yes, in March, we talked with the board about the need for potentially, I think our language was that some schools might possibly, perhaps, maybe benefit from a calendar change to improve the efficiency of the school by reducing schools that are multi-track and underutilized to either a single track or traditional calendar to improve the operational efficiency of the school, as well as to improve the principal's ability to offer equitable resources across all of, for all of the students. As an under-enrolled multi-track school, sometimes that can be a challenge. So we started by hosting some engagement sessions, as well as opening up some thought exchanges. And we're super thankful for all of you that may have already participated in one of these sessions or activities. Your feedback is invaluable to the process. We do want to be clear. Sometimes the information that we're asking for is, how would this impact your family? It is clear to us that by and large, the majority of families in these school areas would prefer to keep a year-round calendar. We do understand that, and we're also looking at other operational concerns as we come to our final recommendations as staff. But we do want to say that that was very clearly heard, and we'll kind of talk through that. But as you can see here, we sent out invitations to just under 9,000 students, families. So it's basically using the student ID number. We identified students who were either attending one of the impacted schools, living in the base attendance area for one of the impacted schools, or living in the base attendance area for one of the schools that feeds into one of the middle schools that we're reviewing in this conversation. We had a total of 665 total participants across these virtual sessions, either by their live participation at a rate of 299 or through views as of April 28th. So we've had a few more people view those recordings. So we will continue to record these sessions because we have realized it's a very valuable resource for the community. We'll start by looking at the feedback we gathered from the Northeastern area communities. This was mostly the families impacted by the recommendations related to Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle. It was very clear from the information session, based on the nature of the questions that were asked, that families really want stability. They want to feel like they're not being changed either by calendar or assignment on a regular basis. There were some concerns, very specific concerns about the enrollment projections being used. Wake Forest is a growing community. Roseville continues to have some residential growth. And so just wanting to make sure that the planning team was aware of all of the developments that are coming. And so the team has really been reviewing that information in a very detailed fashion. Looking for less disruption. Maybe let's not change things if we can avoid it. That year-round preference that I mentioned as we started this portion of the conversation, potential for overcrowding, some concerns that, is it too soon if we were to go from multi-track to single track or traditional? Could that potentially overcrowd the schools? Are there too many students to, fit in a school on either a single track or traditional calendar? And then, of course, unintended outcomes. And this was a unique feature that was brought up, I think, just in this community. What are those impacts that might cascade from this? Maybe there are teachers who would feel like they don't want to stay at the school. Maybe retaining staff could be an issue. Perhaps families might choose other options and maybe even leave the district. So comments like that would be in that type of a category. In addition to the information session, we also, as I mentioned, opened a thought exchange. The thought exchange did capture thoughts and ideas from both parents and staff. So for tonight's session, we're just going to focus on the comments that came from the parents and the community members. However, if you'd like to see the full report, just go to our website. You'll be able to click on the interactive report, and you can see all of the responses from everybody who participated in the thought exchange. But as you can see, unsurprisingly, 97% of the families that participated indicated that they lived in the northeastern portion of the county. That's where the schools are located, so that makes sense. And there's a relatively even distribution, slightly higher proportion of respondents saying that they had affiliations with the middle school, because we were, again, as I mentioned, looking at Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle. We had just over 200 participants submit just over 300 thoughts, and so we're very thankful for all of that active participation. And when we looked at the thoughts that were being presented by families participating from this region, these core themes came out: educational outcomes, year-round benefits, capacity and infrastructure, enrollment and assignment, and then family and community impact. This particular graphic represents the STAR scores for the thoughts that were in each of these themes, which lets us know that things like educational outcomes and year-round benefits really ranked the highest, had the highest STAR rating of thoughts that were in these categories. And that's not to say that any of the others are low. All of them were at or above a 4.0 level. So that means there's a lot of synergy or agreement or consensus in this area on the thoughts that were being presented. So it was clear to us that the members that were participating in the thought exchange were relatively in agreement on the thoughts that were being posted. And here you see the top 3 thoughts just as examples. Again, if you'd like to really dive into the full report, there's an interactive version of the report where you can click on each of those bars and see the thoughts that were being made. You could even explore what were the top thoughts by theme, and you could also look at thoughts that were presented by staff as well as by parents and guardians. So again, coming out of this particular session, it was very clear that the community very much appreciated the year-round calendar and would prefer not to go to a traditional calendar. In addition, it was also obvious that there was some growth coming in the community and that the community wanted to make sure that the data the planning team has is aligned with what the municipality is sharing. What we noticed is a common ground. Regardless, there were a handful of families, believe it or not, who actually believe that traditional calendar could be a good thing for their community and for these schools, these 2 schools in particular. But when we looked at those as maybe, let's say, opposing viewpoints, the common ground between all of them was that making sure we're looking at student needs and family needs when deciding the school calendar should be important, that the board should be thinking about that and the planning team should be thinking about that. So that's the Northeastern session. The Southern and Southwestern areas, focusing on schools like Holly Grove Elementary, Holly Grove Middle, Holly Springs Elementary, and Rex Road Elementary, had a similar feedback, really supportive of the year-round calendar. Definitely talking about a single track versus traditional was a key theme. And again, this is from the questions and comments that were shared with us during the information session on this particular topic. The timing of the change, we actually had some saying we can see that our schools are a little bit underutilized. If we're going to make the change, could we expedite it and do it in 27, 28 instead of waiting until 28, 29? Recognizing that Holly Grove and Holly Grove Elementary and Holly Grove Middle are on the same campus, could we make sure that their calendars were the same since the 2 schools are located on the same campus? There's a thought that there might be a loss of choice, that perhaps families particularly move into an area wanting the year-round calendar, and changing the calendar feels like a loss of choice. There are also the concerns about mismatched calendars. So if one school were to be year-round and one school was to be traditional, or if one school was track 4 and one school was traditional along the feeder pattern, just concerns about trying to avoid that wherever possible. And then also recognizing that many of the schools in this area have been on the multi-track year-round calendar for many years, as many as 10 or 15, even 20 years, and just recognizing that a whole community has been established around this particular school calendar, and infrastructure in the community has been set around that calendar. Because there were 4 schools, we did see a slightly higher rate of participation, but that's expected because we had more students and families potentially impacted by these schools' calendars. So we had 480 participants post 536 thoughts with right around 12,500 ratings. That's really good participation. Again, thank you to those of you that have been participating in this discussion throughout the process. You can see that there's a little bit of an even distribution between the Holly Grove Elementary and Holly Grove Middle parents, slightly less at Holly Springs and slightly less at Rex Road Elementary. To be expected at Rex Road, it's a brand new school. It has a slightly lower enrollment, so we wouldn't expect that to have high rates of participation just because the total school enrollment is a little bit lower than the other schools on the list. Again, not surprisingly, the vast majority of participants indicated they live in the southwestern part of the county. And the themes in this area, while similar, are slightly different than the ones that we saw for the northeastern area. Again, we're focusing just on the responses from the parents and the community members. The staff responses, if you'd like to see those, are also included in that online interactive version of the report. Year-round benefits became the highest rated theme in this area. Enrollment and capacity was the second highest. Moving on to family impact, staff and teacher considerations, as well as community and economic impact. So similar but slightly nuanced perspectives in this part of the county. The only thing that's a little bit different is that none of the comments in this one had a higher than a 4.0 average star rating. That doesn't mean a whole lot, other than that there's probably a lot of consensus around this topic, and then the areas here, there might be a little bit more disparity between the opinions. It could be that some people really believe that there's going to be enrollment and capacity issues where others might not feel like that's as big of a concern. It's not to devalue any of these themes. They are all important. It's just to let you know that there's maybe a little bit more disagreement in this community over what would be the appropriate approach. However, you do see that the highest rated thoughts do still focus on that idea of supporting a year-round calendar, loving the schedule. There's this idea, again, that that's continuity with Holly Grove Elementary and Holly Grove Middle being on the same campus. And then a little shout out for more funding for public schools. We appreciate that type of sentiment. We certainly agree. So again, if there are community members that were supporting the year-round calendar versus those that were supporting maybe a traditional calendar, if those two opinions were at odds, we did find some common agreement similarly in looking at the impact on families and the community when deciding on the school calendar, making sure that they're in the best interest of the students' education and well-being. And so that's something that everyone can center around regardless of how they might feel about which calendar would be a more appropriate or better calendar for their family. And then the third area that we talked with families was the Northwestern area. So at the time that we conducted this particular information session and opened this thought exchange, we were looking at Carpenter Elementary, Morrisville Elementary, Pleasant Grove Elementary, Sycamore Creek Elementary, and Briar Creek Elementary. So during this session, this virtual session, based on the comments and questions that were provided by participants, we could see that there were some crowding concerns, really looking at the fact that in some of the instances, we would have to reassign students out of the school in order to have all of the students fit in a single track or traditional calendar operating schedule. Areas that have been impacted by recent reassignments, particularly Pleasant Grove Elementary, had recently had a major reassignment and boundary change, and just concerns about constant change for families in this particular area. Looking at the enrollment projections, somewhat similar to what we saw in the Northeastern session, just making sure that the planning team is aware of all of the residential development that's coming to this region and the schedule and timing of those developments. Similar to what we've seen in all 3 sessions, a preference for the year-round calendar. Here was a bit of a unique one that came up, was the impact on future siblings. What would happen for students who aren't in school yet or who haven't matriculated into the school system yet? How would these types of changes impact those younger siblings? And then similar to the recent reassignments is the regular adjustments, just really wanting to hit home for the planning team and make sure that everyone is thinking through the fact that the area has been impacted by changes in recent history, and just how does that play into the decision-making framework. The thought exchange for this area had 274 participants that posed 280 thoughts with just over 5,000 ratings. We had 5 elementary schools. We didn't have a middle school in this area, so that did lower the total number of participants that could have participated. We did see the highest rate of participation for Sycamore Creek Elementary, with the next highest being at Carpenter, and then it balanced out a little bit between Morrisville and Pleasant Grove, and then rounding out with Briar Creek Elementary. Because this area spans right just southwest of the airport, near the airport, and then northwest of the airport, we saw a little bit more of a distribution of students across families identifying as being from slightly different regions. So they identified that they were from the northwest as well as from the northern area, and then a portion from the western area. This makes sense based on the locations of the schools. And again, this is just looking at the parent and community feedback. The staff feedback is included in what the board was presented, or what was presented to the board on May 5th, and it is in the interactive reports that you can find online. But since this is a community session, we wanted to focus on what the parent and community members were saying. Here we see that the themes shook out as teacher and staff well-being, learning retention, community growth and capacity, calendar consistency, and family impact. Similar yet slightly nuanced themes. Again, each area takes on its own unique personality and has its own unique perspectives. Here you see that the highest rated series of thoughts within a theme were on the teacher and staff well-being section, and the next highest with learning retention. And then you start seeing the others as they scale down. Again, being at that 4-point or above mark lets us know that there's some good agreement or consensus in these particular themes. The community growth and capacity, while it's above a 3.5, that still is a pretty decent amount of consensus. But as we get below that 3.5 mark, is where it starts to show that there might be a little bit of different perspectives from different community members on these particular topics. Again, all are valuable, all thoughts are reviewed and evaluated, but it just kind of lets us know where the group is thinking about the thoughts that have been shared. The highest rated thoughts for this particular thought exchange took on a slightly different perspective, talking about summer camp availability being a concern, and maybe even the cost of those, looking at the benefits of the year-round learning and the year-round schedule, and then loving the year-round schedule. So we're seeing some common themes across, like it is not lost on the planning team or on the staff or even on the board that many families really have come to love their year-round calendar and really appreciate the flexibility that that provides for their families. And so that's, the planning team and the staff, and as well as the board, are taking all of that into consideration as they get to the point where final decisions are made. Again, similarly, we had groups that were in favor of year-round, and there are some that are in favor of traditional, although they might not have the highest rated thoughts. There are community members that really see the benefit of having that K-12 continuity and having a traditional calendar across all 3 grade levels for their families. However, regardless of where a family might sit, it looks like as a whole, taking into consideration all of the thoughts and comments and rating, that both sides agree on stability for families and students. And that's a slightly unique perspective in this region as compared to the others, and said that whether it's traditional or year-round, maintaining a consistent schedule that aligns with family needs and minimizes disruptions is important. And so that's what was heard throughout the various sessions and thought exchanges for these 3 areas. So overall, through the end of April, or close to the end of April, we saw that just under 4,000 views of our calendar conversion page. So we know that that has been a really good resource for our families, and we will continue to add content to that page to make sure that it continues to be a useful tool for you as we move through the rest of this process. That those live sessions we've already talked about, we had 299 participants in the live sessions across all 3 sessions, and we had 366 views of those sessions by the time we were reporting data on 4/28. So we know that those numbers have continued to climb. With the online forums across all 3 thought exchanges, we had 1,251 participants post 1,449 thoughts. So we really appreciate all of the feedback that everyone has provided to get us to this point. So again, all of the information that I've just shared is available on our website. You can access it by going to the assignment planning site and clicking on step 6, or you can go directly to the page by going to this, I think it's called a pretty URL, at the calendar conversion. Those are one and the same. So you've got two ways you can get to that information. If you're just now joining us or have joined us since we gave these instructions, we are using the Q&A feature in Google Meet, and it looks like it's working. I'm seeing some questions come in. As a reminder, we're going to keep all of your questions anonymous. So when you see that your question has been removed, that lets you know that our moderators have successfully captured it, and we'll work to address that later in tonight's session. All right, so let's jump into the calendar recommendations, or the recommendations for calendar conversion. So as part of this whole process, once we conduct all of the community engagement, it is our responsibility as staff to make recommendations to the board. Just as a reminder, what got us here is that we're looking at schools that were operating on a year-round calendar but did not have long-term crowding concerns. So the list of schools that we started with were all operating either under 85% utilization, or were on the same campus as a school that was operating under 85% on the multi-track year-round. So some things that we look at before we get to the point where we're thinking that a calendar conversion would be an appropriate support is there projected growth in the region or in near the school or in the school's attendance area? If so, let's let that growth come, and maybe we let the school sit. So for our new schools like Pleasant Plains Elementary, Woods Creek Elementary that opened on the multi-track year-round calendar, we know that they have growth in their base attendance areas. So we're going to continue to let them operate on the multi-track year-round and let that growth fill the school up organically. Are there nearby schools that have crowding? And you'll see a couple that have come off the list from our original discussion based on this point. Are there nearby schools that are maybe capped or overcrowded, and maybe it makes sense to change the boundaries of some schools in the region and take advantage of the capacity at some of these multi-track year-round schools to support relieving those overcrowded schools? Are there an extensive amount of mobile units on the campus? Is it time to maybe remove the mobile units? Would that solve some of the utilization concerns on the site? Then we get to calendar optimization. Can we improve the efficiency of the school and streamline the operations and provide better access to academic programming and supports by having all students on the same calendar, be it single track 4 or traditional? And then we're not talking about these today. These would be future considerations, but at some point there might be sites in our district where looking at the program that's being offered on the site needs to be reviewed, but that's not part of today's conversation. So we're kind of in this space and trying to determine, is calendar optimization the appropriate approach to support a school that is operating under 85% utilization. So we're going to do a quick hit so everyone knows what the actual recommendations are, and then we'll go a little bit more deeply into how we got to these recommendations. Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle are both located on the same campus. And because of the unique situation with growth in the Wake Forest area and crowding at some nearby elementary schools, we presented the board with 3 potential solutions to address the needs in this community. We do understand that the community really would prefer to stay on year-round, and staff heard that and the planning team heard that. There are also some other considerations related to K-12 alignment that we've been hearing across the board from families throughout the district, as well as access issues at the middle school level for things that happen during trackouts. So at the middle school level, there are a lot of activities, athletics, academic opportunities like competitions that happen during the trackout periods. And during those trackout periods, there's usually no staff on campus. There are no buses running, those types of things. And so for some students, it makes it very challenging and difficult for them to be able to participate in those programs. So just thinking through that piece, and then also what we've been hearing from family members across the county over the last several years about preferring, K-12 calendar continuity, or at least K-8 calendar continuity, if at all possible. A couple of different options were proposed for this area. So at the elementary level, the board was asked to weigh and consider whether or not the elementary school could remain on the multi-track year-round calendar, but perhaps have an expansion of its boundary so that it could fill up a little bit more. Perhaps change it to a track 4 only school so that we could get those operational efficiency pieces in place while we wait to see how the growth and the development in the region pans out to determine whether or not it might go back to multi-track year-round in the future if it needed to do so. Or perhaps go to a traditional calendar and then align that with the middle school on a traditional calendar, and then work to resolve the growth and crowding issues that might be coming in the future in the Wake Forest area with the other schools in the region. And so we didn't get specific or clear direction from the board on this, so we're going to be continuing to take feedback here. Again, we've heard very loud and clear that the community would prefer that both schools stay on some type of a year-round calendar. Track 4, what I think would be ideal. Our biggest concern is what I mentioned about the equity issues for the middle school. And then also there are families who are base assigned to Jones Dairy Elementary, which is a nearby multi-track year-round school. And that school would need to continue to operate on multi-track year-round. So from a planning and a long-range stability for families perspective, staff was concerned that those families would then have a multi-track year-round elementary, a track 4 middle school, and a traditional high school. Having those 3 calendars by base assignment just seemed very disruptive and destabilizing to those families, because we could not guarantee that all families that have siblings at both the middle school and the elementary school could be aligned on track 4. So it's quite possible you could have one student on track 1, 2, or 3 at the elementary level. In fact, it's likely an older student on track 4 at the middle school. And then if you have one that's old enough, an older student on the high school and traditional calendar. So we were trying to avoid that type of disruption. That's where the recommendation for traditional at the middle school really came from. But we'll dig into that a little deeper. The Holly Springs area, again, to be clear, based on some feedback from the community about, hey, can we accelerate this? Can we go ahead and do this for 27, 28? And also thinking about those same access issues at the middle school level and the fact that both schools are on the same campus and that there is sufficient capacity in nearby elementary schools to absorb the future growth in the Holly Springs area. The recommendation was that Holly Grove Elementary and Holly Grove Middle go traditional as early as the 27-28 school year, and that Holly Springs Elementary go to track 4 because it is the closest school to the Viridia area. So if that growth is needed to be supported by a local elementary school, Woods Creek and Holly Springs kind of nestle around that community. And then Rex Road convert to a track 4 as it is the last school on that side of the county. So as residential development and growth comes in that part of the county, it's possible it would need to flex back up to a multi-track to absorb the feedback. I am seeing that a handful of people are trying to use the raise the hand feature. We won't be using that in this meeting. Again, we're using the Q&A feature. So please put your comments or your questions in the Q&A tool, and we'll get to those as we get towards the end of the session. For the Northwestern area, you'll see that there are 5 schools that were originally being reviewed, and based on the community feedback and thinking through that series of approaches that I talked about as we opened this section of the presentation, Briar Creek, Carpenter, and Morrisville have actually been removed from the list for consideration for this round, for this cycle of planning. And instead, we're going to focus more on looking at expanding the boundaries for both Carpenter and Morrisville Elementary. These schools are nestled in between several capped and overcrowded elementary schools, and the community feedback and sentiment was that, we'd prefer to keep that and reassign students into the school from these capped and overcrowded schools. In addition, both Carpenter and Morrisville Elementary are aligned to Alston Ridge Middle School, which operates on a multi-track year-round and is full. It's close to 100% capacity. So we wouldn't be able to convert that school. And so that would create a really undesirable feeder pattern of, let's say, a traditional elementary school going into a multi-track year-round middle school and then back out to a traditional high school. Knowing that a new high school is coming in the region in 27, 28, and a new middle school is coming in the region sometime after 2030, the planning team thought the more long-range stable option for these families would be to say, let's see if we can expand the attendance areas for these schools and keep them on a multi-track year-round, and then keep an eye on them for potential future calendar conversions if residential development does not pick back up in this community. Briar Creek is a slightly different situation. There, you'll see the numbers. They are a little more crowded than some of the other schools. It's too soon to consider converting them to a traditional calendar or single track. So we'll continue to monitor this school and see whether or not we should reduce the attendance boundary of the school, and then perhaps come to look at this as a future conversion in a future year if needed. Pleasant Grove Elementary is specifically being recommended to go to track 4 for the 27-28 school year. This is in response to the community feedback, as well as the fact that, similar to Rex Road, the school is right on the county line. So if there's any growth that comes in that region of the county, it's sort of our last stop for elementary schools in the region. So we're looking to make sure that that school has the flexibility to convert back to multi-track as needed as growth comes back to this area. In addition, families at this school were recently assigned from a multi-track elementary school into the school about 3 years ago. And so trying to provide some calendar stability there. Sycamore Creek, we've recommended track 4 to minimize the disruption and can keep the year-round calendar, but we have seen some feedback. It's not official yet because the thought exchange is still open, that perhaps now that Pine Hollow is traditional, a traditional calendar might be a better alignment for Sycamore Creek. So we're going to continue to review that feedback that we're receiving before we make a final recommendation to the board. The difference between the two schools is that Sycamore Creek has a relatively large 4th and 5th grade cohort. So we need to allow time for that age group to age out before the school could, properly fit on a traditional or single track calendar. And that's why we're recommending that wait until the 28-29 school year. Just a couple of things. We've talked about operational efficiency a lot from the staff perspective. We just want to let you know that at the elementary level, an initial analysis showed that depending on the site, we could save the district funds by reducing anywhere from 11 and a half to 14 and a half months of employment. That's not staff members. That would be taking 12 and 11-month staff members down to the 10 months that a traditional calendar or a single track 4 would use. In addition, based on the different schools, there are certain allotment formulas that shift when you're going from traditional to year-round. Year-rounds just cost a little bit more. We have to add more money into the kitty to make the year-round schools function. And so some of those reductions would be included as well. We're going to provide salary estimates here. I think we did share it's in the minimum of $90,000 a year savings per elementary school. Some of them are a little bit higher. At the middle school level, it's even greater savings. It's anywhere from 22 and a half months to 35 and a half months of savings by converting to either a traditional or traditional or single track 4. And again, some of these are formulas that are giving extra funds to multi-track schools, and some of these are taking those 12-month positions and bringing them down to a 10-month position. In no instances would any staff specifically lose their position, but there are some staff that would absolutely be impacted by some pay rate changes as they go from being 12 months to 10 months. So there's a lot of these things that we have to consider as a district as we're supporting our staff and our families in these changes. For this group, it was well over 100,000, and I think one was even closer to $200,000 a year that could be saved by making the change from a multi-track to either traditional or single track. And I'll be clear, the cost savings from this perspective is the same if the schools are converted to either track 4 or traditional. It's the equity and access issues that we're talking about at the middle school level that are improved when we go to traditional. When we talk with transportation, it looks like routes would be the same. Those of you that are impacted by, like, let's say Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle, or Holly Grove Elementary and Holly Grove Middle, if your students are on a shared route with their older siblings, those would still be maintained. So we wouldn't really see a lot of route changes, but we'll have a more detailed analysis for the presentation on the 19th. But right now it looks like transportation impacts would be nominal and would certainly not cost any more for the district to operate. So we've already talked through some of the recommendations. Again, the only reason that we're talking about Heritage Elementary is because, first, with the trailers on the campus, it's operating below 85%, and Heritage Middle is doing the same. But because the two schools are located on the same campus, we really felt like we needed to have a community conversation about both schools. Some considerations, which some of you are familiar with, these were shared in March as well as at the May 5th presentation. We just need to be thoughtful about the impacts on the middle school because it is on the same site. In addition, there are some mobile classrooms on the site that we could continue to monitor to determine if it's time for them to be removed. There has not been significant enrollment growth for the school itself, and we'll talk in greater detail about that in a future slide. And then I mentioned this earlier in my brief about why the recommendations were coming for traditional for Heritage Middle. There is the concern about the Jones Dairy families that would have to have that sort of 3 different calendars as a family going through their process, and we really were trying to find a way to avoid that for those families as well. Yes, there is a significant amount of growth that is projected in Wake Forest and even kind of dipping over here towards North Roseville that is going to impact this region over time. However, this area right here is starting to see, little to no growth, if not even a reduction in total student enrollments based on current residential development patterns. So we do work very closely with the county planners to get all of the information from them, and it has been considered. The issue that we're presenting to the board and that we're sharing as a planning team is that the specific attendance area for the two schools, because it's more in this area, that area by itself isn't growing. And so the question becomes, do we need to maintain capacity at these two schools to support growth that's happening sort of north and northwest and northeast of the school? Or could we rely on the capacity that's available at these elementary schools to kind of absorb some of that growth over time? So that's the debate at the elementary level, is should the elementary school remain multi-track and maybe have an expansion of its attendance area to resolve or reduce the crowding at schools like Richland Creek Elementary, perhaps Roseville Elementary, allow Jones Dairy to go ahead and open back up track 2 and let it grow into its track 2. Sanford Creek could then grow into its track 2. They've got some space to do that, and then let the two heritages have the same calendar. So that's still option 1 would be keep a Heritage Elementary multi-track, but then maybe change its attendance boundaries. Or perhaps we go to a traditional and align it to the middle school. You'll see at the middle school level, and you can see sort of the crowding here, and some of you've probably already looked at this. We do present information with trailers just for your awareness because we know that the trailers are there, that's capacity that's available, but we also look at the capacity without trailers just so that we get a feel for an ideal future state. So if we're looking at the projected crowding for 26-27, you'll see that there's still sufficient room at schools like North Forest Pines, Forest Pines. There'd even be a little bit of room at Heritage Elementary if we were to remove all the trailers, but we are starting to get tight at schools like Roseville and Richland Creek. And so those are all the things the planning team and staff are continuing to weigh and assess as we get to the next presentation. At the middle school level, the picture's a little bit different. All of the middle schools in the region have sufficient capacity. And so there's not a need for any of these schools to operate on the multi-track year-round because there is sufficient capacity to absorb not just the current enrollment, but even the future enrollment growth in the region. And as you can see, most of them do not have trailers on campus as their capacity is the same with or without trailers. There are a handful of trailers at Wakefield Middle still, and there's a handful of trailers at Wake Forest Middle. So we wouldn't want to be thoughtful about that impact, knowing that Wake Forest Middle might need the trailers a little bit longer. So here you see that talk through of those various options. So the option A would be to have Heritage Middle go ahead and convert to traditional in the 28-29, better utilizing the facility, giving that flexibility for class schedules and program offerings, having all the students on the same calendar really helps to make sure that all of your students can have access to all of the programming in an equitable fashion. Definitely improving that access to those extracurricular and after school programming because all of the students would be on the traditional calendar. They could ride the bus to school on the days when they have after school events, and staff would be in session at the school on those days as well, so that when we need volunteers or parent volunteers to help out, those things are improved. And there was some discussion about that at the board table with our athletic director. So if you're interested, you could review that part of the YouTube recording on our Wake County website to kind of help you hear how that conversation played out. And then while it does shift from a K-8 calendar alignment for families, it does provide a 6-12 calendar alignment because in option A, Heritage Elementary would remain multi-track and have its boundary expanded to provide more students for Heritage Elementary and relief to some schools in the area that are starting to get crowded. This does allow for stability for families that are currently attending the school. And it does give us some space to grow into, specifically thinking about the K-3 class size legislation and how that impacts our elementary schools differently than crowding might impact our middle schools. The second option at the Heritage level, again, keeping the traditional for the middle school, would be to convert the elementary to a single track 4 or reduce the tracks to a single track 4. That way we wouldn't have to necessarily go and do any boundary adjustments, but it would give us the flexibility in the future if development did generate more students and we needed to identify seats for those students. It would already have the infrastructure, already be operating on track 4, and we could expand back to multi-track at a future date. You may be familiar with the school Lake Myra Elementary in Wendell. It opened on multi-track, it reduced to track 4 and stayed there for a good 7+ years. And now the development in the Wendell Falls community has really finally hit the point where we need to access that capacity again, and the school is going back to multi-track. So that would be an example of where we've used that process in the past. And then the other option to give K-12 calendar alignment for families and kind of just move forward with Heritage Elementary, Heritage Middle, and even Heritage High School being on the traditional calendar. and then reducing the capacities for both of those schools. It does reduce our flexibility to expand back to multi-track. We don't really like to take traditional schools and make them multi-track if we don't have to. And we know that families, that's a big disruption for families. We've learned that, especially with the recent Pleasant Grove conversion. It's a major shift for families and for staff. But it would allow for K-12 calendar alignment. And then if we did need to have expanded seats at the elementary level in this region, we'd have to rely on the other elementary schools in the region to support that growth. This also avoids any needing to match track. So any students from Jones Dairy would just simply go from their multi-track year-round to traditional, and they would only have the 2 calendars in their experience instead of 3. When we look at the southern and southwestern area, similar type approach, right? Looking at the schools that are operating underutilized. Now, Rexroad's a bit of an anomaly, as I remind you, it's a brand new school. It's only in its first year of operations. We expected it to be under enrolled. That's part of how we open our new schools, with a mixture of current residents and new undeveloped land. And so it's got quite a bit of undeveloped land in its attendance area. You can see, similar to Heritage, we've had the area that's around the current base attendance areas for the schools has had a drop, just based on the new school openings in the region. So at Holly Grove Elementary, it's on the same campus as Holly Grove Middle, similar to the conversation I just shared with you about Heritage Elementary. Because of recent reassignments, the attendance boundary has been reduced, and so it does not need to be multi-track long-term to sustain that particular population. Just going to pause for a moment. I see some people raising hands. We're not using the raising hand feature in this session. So if you'll please just use the Q&A feature to post your questions or your comments. We'll get to those in just a few moments. The site does host 3 mobile units, and the middle school doesn't have any mobile units. There's not been any significant enrollment growth in the base attendance area, and there's not much projected through 2035. These 2 schools are relatively, not Holly Grove Middle, but Holly Grove Elementary is a little bit more landlocked, if you will. We do need to think about the impacts on the tracks for the middle school loading. And one thing to think about for this particular school, similar to a school we'll talk about in the future, Sycamore, is that any stability transfers for students currently attending the school where their address has been assigned, let's say to Rexroad Elementary, will age out in the next year or 2. So they won't need to have space for those students much longer. Some other things to think about are Buckhorn Creek Elementary, as well as Holly Grove Elementary, Lincoln Heights Elementary, and Rexroad all feed into Holly Grove Middle, or at least a portion of their base attendance area feeds into Holly Grove Middle, and 2 of those schools currently operate on a traditional calendar. For Holly Springs Elementary, it has had some recent reassignments that reduced its base attendance area, so it is a smaller attendance area for the school. It's already not operating a track 3, or at least for the 26-27 school year. It does have 14 mobile classrooms that they're not currently needing to use, many of, if any. They don't have projected enrollment growth in their base attendance area, and the base students feed into Holly Ridge Middle, which is a traditional calendar middle school. And again, similar to Holly Grove Elementary, the stability transfers will soon age out, and they won't need to have as much room for those 4th and 5th graders that are aging forward. Rexroad is a new school, as I mentioned, that opened for this current school year. It doesn't have any mobile units. It has sufficient capacity to absorb the growth that is now projected through 2035. When the school was first developed and designed and constructed, the rate of construction in the Holly Grove community was much higher. The developments that were being approved were much more expansive, and they still are, just some of them have slowed in the rate of development. And so since it has so much undeveloped land, that's why we're recommending the track 4 for this school, because once those developments finally do take off and they catch back up and we start seeing that growth and development in the area, it is possible that Rex might need to expand to multi-track to absorb all the growth that would come in the future. Just doesn't need it right yet. It might, but it will need it in the future. And again, we need to think about the fact that it feeds into Holly Grove Middle. So again, you're seeing most of the growth is north of where the schools are. There is a new school here to absorb the growth. As we mentioned, Holly Springs Elementary is a school that could convert back to multi-track if needed. That's why we're recommending track 4. And in this area, you can see we're really starting to see a stabilization and a slowing of growth. Also, there's capacity at Woods Creek, there's capacity at Holly Springs, there's capacity at Herbert Akins, there's capacity at Holly Springs, and of course Rex. So at the elementary level, there is sufficient capacity in the region that if Holly Grove Elementary were to go traditional and the other handful of schools were to go track 4, that would give us the flexibility we would need to respond to potential future growth in the community. And here you can see those projections for 26, 27. Obviously, Buckhorn's operating on a traditional calendar. Holly Ridge is operating on a traditional calendar. Both of these schools were impacted by those recent reassignments and have older cohorts that are going to age out through the stability transfers. So they will start to have some relief in the next couple of years. But however, Holly Ridge does have trailers that it can use until it gets to the point where it doesn't need to use those trailers. And the same thing is true for Oakview. At the middle school level, similar to what we saw in the Heritage area, you've got plenty of capacity in these three middle schools. This school's not quite at capacity. And then Lufkin is an area where there is some fluctuations and they're starting to pick back up. But we do have plenty of capacity in these three schools to absorb the growth in this region. And here you can see how that breaks out. So then the recommendations specifically for this area in a slightly greater detail are that Holly Grove Elementary and Holly Grove Middle operate on a traditional calendar effective for the 27-28 school year. And this implementation avoids families having to have multiple changes in calendar because there will at least be a track reduction. So rather than having a track reduction and then switch to track 4, so a family, that maybe goes from a track 2 to a track 1 and then to a track 4, that would be terrible for families. And some families had even said, could we just go ahead and expedite this and move this forward? So if we do the traditional calendar in 27, 28, hold tight through 26, 27, it's one change, and then you have that K-12 calendar alignment long term. Again, we've already talked about the extracurricular impacts at the middle school level. And of course, either traditional or track 4 allows for that flexibility for the principals to do a better job of distributing resources for all students. So you get that win, if you will, either way. But we also have this avoiding the need to match tracks. If the middle school's on traditional, then any students assigned to the middle school out of, let's say, a track 4 or a multi-track elementary school would just convert to traditional and then stay traditional through high school. So it'd be one change for the family instead of 2. Holly Springs Elementary, we've talked through this in a little bit of detail, so I won't spend too much time, but the recommendation is that it become track 4 again for the 27-28 school year. It avoids having to have those multiple track changes, better utilizes the facility, creates that flexibility for class scheduling. It does provide a little bit of stability for those that have become accustomed to track outs. And it also gives us the ability to flex back to multi-track in the future if needed, if the growth comes in as currently projected in the 10-year outlook. Again, we will not be using the raising the hands feature in this particular session. If you'll please put your comments or thoughts in the Q&A feature, we'll get to those in just a few minutes. I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can to this next section. So for the Northwestern area, as we've already talked about, Briar Creek, Carpenter, and Morrisville are no longer being considered for a calendar conversion in this cycle. And part of it, you can see why. If they were to convert to a traditional or track 4, they are the schools that would be immediately overcrowded and probably require an attendance boundary change. And as we zip through this, you'll see that we're going to now really focus on Pleasant Grove and Sycamore Creek. So for Pleasant Grove, it was impacted by a significant reassignment in 23-24. It's currently not operating on track 2. It doesn't have any mobile units. There's no significant growth in the near term. And it does have a split feeder because of waiting for Parkside Middle, that between Alston Ridge Middle, West Cary Middle, and Leesville Road Middle. And these two operate on traditional, and this is the only multi-track in the group. The area is definitely going to be impacted by the opening of Parkside Middle School. So converting to track 4 just gives us a lot of flexibility in making sure all of that works when that school opens, regardless of what calendar that school might, the board might approve for that school. For Sycamore Creek, currently not operating a track 2, no mobile units, no significant growth. With the opening of Barton Pond, a significant amount of the crowding at the school has been effectively relieved. They do feed into all traditional schools, either Leesville, Oberlin, or Pine Hollow Middle School. And a reduction of the attendance boundary, if we wait till 28-29, would not be required. So we are looking at a 28-29 implementation year for Sycamore Creek Elementary. Again, you can see not a lot of growth in this portion of the county, with a little bit of growth here, and that would be aligned with Pleasant Grove. And this is the type of growth that's assigned with schools like Hortons Creek or even the yeah, Hortons Creek is on that side of the map, perhaps Parkside Elementary. So the concern here is that maybe perhaps we could look at the CAP schools of Cedar Fork, Hortons Creek, White Oak. You also have a couple more CAP schools over here with Northwoods and Weatherstone in this sort of area right here. So could we not look at maybe changing the boundaries for Carpenter and Morrisville, expand those a little bit to relieve crowding at some of those nearby Captain overcrowded schools. And then, looking at where Pleasant Grove is located, we wouldn't need to do that. We could just simply reduce it to a single track. Here you can see that there's plenty of capacity in the region, with the exception of Briar Creek. And you can see there's we've got some concerns about crowding without trailers. We certainly have some room with trailers, but we'd like to get to this state in the future. So perhaps we could reduce the crowding at Cedar Fork. We could reduce the crowding at Hortons Creek, maybe even Northwoods, by using the seats that are available at Carpenter and Morrisville. So again, specifically, the recommendation is for Sycamore to go single track in 28-29. That's the earliest we could implement this one and not have to worry about reassigning students out of the school. We have seen, as I mentioned in our current thought exchange, that some families are wondering if traditional could be considered since it does align to Pine Hollow Middle. So that'll be shared with the planning team for review and consideration. Pleasant Grove Elementary, the recommendation is to go track 4 as early as the 27-28 school year. And again, that just gives us that flexibility to increase the seats in the future should growth resurge and rebound in this region. And so the proposed stability rule. So what does this mean for you? Let's say the board approves everything as suggested. I don't think we're done. I think we've got some massaging to do on some of the recommendations, but let's just go forward. They move forward with all of the recommendations. If a student is assigned to the school as a base student, they would, of course, remain assigned to the school and they would not experience a school change, just the calendar change. However, if the school is converted to a traditional calendar and the family really wanted to stay on the year-round calendar, they would have priority for consideration if they were to put in a transfer asking for a nearby year-round school that had available seats. We couldn't promise that transportation would be provided, so that's something we'd have to look into case by case depending on if it's a calendar application school or not, but likely it would be without transportation. So just something to think about. You would not have to change schools. You can keep your school. It's just whether or not you'd want to consider changing schools if the year-round calendar was really important to you. If you're at one of these year-round schools as an application student, it's not your base school, but you put in that application and your student gets transportation or is eligible for transportation to the school because it's your identified calendar application school. We would initially assign the students back to their base school because we want to make sure you have transportation. And then from there, this group of students would have the same types of stability options. They could certainly remain at that current school. So let's use Heritage Middle. Let's say Heritage Middle goes traditional and you're there through calendar application. You could just put in that stability transfer and you get to stay through the 8th grade. That way you could have school continuity. If, however, you preferred the year-round calendar, you could look for another year-round school. I think the closest in that region might be Durant Road Middle, and you could apply for that through transfer, and that would be an option, and you'd have priority for selection for that school. And then the other option would be, you know what, we need the transportation, or it's just, if we're going to be traditional, we might as well be traditional at our base school. You could certainly just keep and retain the assignment to the base school. So that's kind of where we're at. The other thing is that the kindergarten and 6th grade siblings that are coming in the year that the implementation happens would have that same priority to join their older sibling at whichever school they're at. And we can talk through some examples of this probably during our Q&A, and I want to get to that because I've seen a lot of questions come through. So where are we in the process? We've had an initial conversation with the board. We did some outreach and public engagement leading up to our presentation. We initially were going to talk with the board at their facilities committee on April 14th. There was a power outage, so they suspended the meeting or adjourned the meeting, and we carried forward that topic to the recent board work session on May 5th. So that's when they received their first set of initial recommendations. The thought exchange, however, has been open that whole time. And then we're scheduled to go to the board on May 19th with a set of final recommendations for their review during work session. And they have asked that we go ahead and bring forward an action item at that same meeting. I think there was discussion at the work session about maybe postponing the decision to June 2nd, but we have been directed by the board that they'll be taking action or expect to take action at the board meeting on May 19th. So May 19th is when the board would be expected to make a final decision on each of the specific recommendations. Once we know what the board has approved, we would then start working directly with families and schools to help them prepare. Since the earliest the present recommendations could take effect for some of these schools is 27, 28, that would give us a little bit of time. We would do some immediate outreach, and then we would do sustained outreach to support families as they're preparing for the 27, 28 school year. And the same would be true if the recommendation was for 28, 29. So if anything gets approved as a 28, 29 implementation, we would have immediate contact with families, and then we would, of course, follow up over the course of the next 2 years to make sure they're prepared for the 28, 29 school year. Separately, I know we have some staff on the call. There'll be separate conversations for staff in appropriate timing and sequence based on the implementation for your site, depending on what the changes are. Again, all of the information we've shared is here. Melissa, I think I'm about ready to hand it over to you so I can get a drink of water and we can start addressing some questions.
Sounds good.
And it sounds like there's a lot of questions, so I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for all of that detailed information. Now we'd like to start addressing as many questions as possible. So please take a few minutes and continue to post questions and comments using the Q&A feature. We'll get started in a moment by addressing questions that were submitted earlier in the presentation. Let's see.
I'm hydrated.
And please do remember Thought Exchange as well. We'll turn back to that in a little bit if you've missed the QR code. Okay, so, well, first off, it looks like there are a few questions with some confusion about when the board is going to vote. And I think you just touched on that with the timeline, but yeah, there was a change at one point during the work session last week where there was a preference for June 2nd, but I believe we have landed on May 19th at this point in time. Does that sound correct?
That is correct. We were directed by the board to go ahead and have the action item ready for the May 19th board meeting.
There's a related question about how the board makes decisions. Does the board vote usually to support whatever staff recommends? Is that always the case?
No. So staff recommends based on what the directives the board gave us, right? So board policy tells us to look for operational efficiency in this particular instance. And so staff is making recommendations based on feedback collected from staff at the schools, principals. We've been taking information, obviously, from the community prior information sessions where communities have told us things like, oh, K-12 calendar alignment would be fantastic, and other types of input, as well as the actual data related to projected growth and crowding in the area. So we take all of those data elements, all of the feedback we've collected over the last several years, and try to come forward with what we think is a sustainable long-range recommendation that would support the operation of the schools and make sure that the students have access to high-quality academic supports. The board then reviews that in light of all of the feedback that's being collected and those same data elements and points, and then they will make a final decision. I know from a different space, actually last year, when there were conversations about schools like North Forest Pines Elementary and Pleasant Union Elementary having a reduction of tracks, staff's initial and final recommendations were that the schools convert from multi-track year-round to traditional, and the board ultimately decided that they would go to track 4 only. And so, yes, there are examples of when the board makes a slightly different decision from what the staff is recommending. So it's not always a carte blanche approval. And I have been told that they'll be looking at these school by school, not as a slate. So they'll take each one up as an individual action item.
Okay, next, why was the Thought Exchange changed from ratings to comments?
Thank you for that question. It was actually in response to feedback from previous engagement sessions that when we do a first round and we rate thoughts and we know what the ratings are and we know, how the community, where there's consensus and where there might be a little bit of disagreement, that if we do it that same format again in the second review. They're like, we've already done this. You know what we think. You already know what we're rating. We want to tell you a little bit more. We want to expand and provide slightly more context. And so in response to that feedback from prior public engagement sessions, for the second round, we chose the slightly different format because we already have the ratings from the first go round. We know what those ratings are. This one allows for a lot more letters, a lot more context. We're getting full paragraphs. We're getting a lot more robust information. And that's what we heard the community saying, is that sometimes that initial thought exchange with the character limit can be a little restricting. So the reason we use the slightly different format for the second round is based on community feedback telling us that they want to give us more robust comments, and that we've already done the rating. We already know what the ratings are. What's the value of rating thoughts again? And so we heard that and we responded to that.
Okay, if there is a very obvious desire for a year-round option, why was year-round track 4 not an option as a potential recommendation?
Sure. And I think that's a very valid question. And we've been hearing it a lot, even in the thought exchange, is that I think I tried to explain it. Let's see if I can find one of them. Maybe we could look at the ones for the southwestern area. So when we look particularly at the middle school level, the major reason for recommending traditional was related to making sure that there was access for programming, particularly outside of school hours, and to reduce the burden on staff that have to volunteer when they're tracked out. So it aligns those operational calendars because candidly, our athletic, our academic teams like the types of robotics teams or any type of academic decathlon type teams, all of those types of programs follow a traditional calendar schedule because the majority of our middle schools in the district do operate on a traditional calendar. And so that takes a lot of stress off of the system, parents, students, and staff, if they're all aligned on the same calendar. In addition, we've heard a lot of feedback from families across the district that whenever possible, can you give us K-12 calendar alignment? Because at some point we're going to have a high schooler, and then having that elementary or middle schooler on a different calendar it becomes very problematic as time passes on. We have seen quite a few comments saying, thank you. I have students in the middle school and high school level. It'd be really great for them to be on the same calendar. So while there's definitely a lot of support for keeping multi-track or even a track 4, the reason staff came out with a recommendation for traditional is really based on those specific pieces. But yes, I will be candid that operationally and in terms of cost savings, those are the same if it's track 4 or traditional. The gains you get at the traditional middle school level are really related to programming and student access.
Well, why have only Heritage Elementary and Jones Dairy Elementary been mentioned as feeder schools to Heritage Middle?
Go ahead.
Are North Forest Pines and Sanford Creek, for instance, feeder schools?
They are not. North Forest Pines feeds into a traditional middle school, and Sanford Creek feeds into a traditional middle school by base assignment. So Heritage would be a school they would have to apply for a transfer into, and we're not always able to approve those transfers. So by base assignment, a portion of Jones Dairy's base assignment area is base assigned to Heritage Middle. So we're talking about those assigned feeder patterns from the district.
Our base middle school is traditional, but we have been planning to request a transfer to our year-round middle school option to maintain the schedule as long as possible. Will we still be able to request a transfer to that middle school even if the calendar changes from year-round to traditional?
Yes, so regardless of the operating calendar of a school, families are welcome during our transfer application period to ask for a transfer to any school in the district based on their unique hardship and specific concerns. So if there's a reason that you're looking at a school because of maybe before and after school care, daycare concerns, proximity to work, things like that, even if it is year-round or traditional, yes, you can always ask for a transfer to those. Just it would all be under the guidance of policy 4150, where it talks about the reasons why staff could approve a transfer in those types of situations. But yes, you could still always ask for a transfer into a different school, regardless of the operating calendar of the school.
Why is the proposal for the heritage schools being made now, at this time of the year when it's very busy?
Oh, that yes. Honestly, I'll say there's not really a good time in the school year. We have tried, and we've actually been taking that into consideration. We're looking at maybe in future cycles advancing the schedule just a little bit so that we don't dip into May. But the reason to have it now is we want to make sure that the board takes action, ideally in May, because that gives family and staff a minimum of 12 to 13 months to be able to prepare for any changes that are approved. And in that longer case, if it's 28, 29, at least 24 months. And we know particularly for staff being able to think about the financial implications of the changes, they need some time to prepare for that. And for families, sometimes it's, vacation schedules that are made well in advance. We're just trying really hard to make sure that the board makes the final decision before the summer so that you have as long as possible to prepare for whatever the changes might be.
There are several concerns about the carpool at at the Heritage campus, and concerns that perhaps it hasn't been evaluated when all tracks are in. And can we talk about how carpool will be evaluated when there are more than 2 tracks in?
So currently, Heritage Elementary and Heritage Middle both operate tracks 1, 3, and 4. So there are times in the year when all 3 tracks are in, and that would be the same traffic flow, if you will, if all the students were on the same track. So whatever that peak time is when tracks 1, 3, and 4 are in at the same time, that would be basically your daily load. We have heard from the school staff and from many families about the concerns about the loop and the traffic flow there, especially recognizing that along that route there are multiple schools that are letting in and letting out at the same time. So we have been sharing that with other members of the central office so that they can think about that when they're thinking about bell schedules, transportation schedules, and the like. But yes, we are aware of it, and it is a going concern. I know that there has been a good partnership with the town. I believe if a traffic light, I think, has been added, and that I may be misspeaking because we talk about a lot of communities, but I know that we're working actively through other departments. It's a little outside the scope of the long range planning and student assignment departments, but we are sharing all of this context with those that can have an impact on traffic patterns. But as far as traffic load goes, today, whenever tracks 1, 3, and 4 are in, that would be the same experience as either being track 4 or traditional for the school. It would just be that would be the daily experience instead of cycled.
There are a few comments regarding trailers. Since trailers are counted as part of the Heritage Elementary's capacity, will they be repaired or replaced within the next year? And then other questions saying, why not remove the mobile units at Heritage Elementary and also at Wake Forest Middle School, and then allow transfers of Wake Forest Middle School to Heritage Middle School?
Sure. So I will say our board has been very clear that whenever possible and when resources are available, I'll be honest, it's not cheap to take trailers off of campuses. So we do have to wait for the monies to sort of build up to where we can do that. But wherever possible, to try to work to reduce our dependence on trailers across the district. So yes, we are actively looking at opportunities to reduce trailers on campuses. In fact, we're already looking to take a few off of the Wake Forest Middle site. Those should be coming off in the next several months. The existing trailers, if a school does need them and they have maintenance concerns, we work with our facilities department to route those maintenance concerns. We are going to continue to serve them as long as they're needed. In terms of taking them off to solve a challenge, as we mentioned with the Heritage Elementary recommendations, there's a lot of potential there. The large reason that Heritage Elementary was included in this discussion is because it's located on the same campus. We've heard very clearly from our schools that are located on the same campus, like the Leesville schools, the Apex Friendship schools, even the Holly Grove schools, right? That if we're on the same campus, try to align our calendars. And so that's part of why this conversation came up. But at the Heritage Elementary level, we talked about the fact that there are multiple options. One would be to leave it multi-track and maybe expand its base attendance area. That's what you saw in option A. One would be to maybe reduce it to track 4. Let's see how that goes. Let's see how the development comes in the area. And then if and when the development does start generating elementary age students, potentially flex back up to multi-track to respond to that growth. Or go ahead and make these two traditional, give that K-12 calendar alignment for these families, and then lean on the other elementary schools in the region to absorb the growth that's coming in the future. So we haven't settled on one here from a staff perspective. We're still sort of weighing the pluses and minuses, because you're right, thinking about trailer units is also something that has to always be weighed and considered. We don't want to continue to depend on trailers long term if we don't have to.
In a slightly different direction, why isn't the district eliminating year-round for all schools?
That's a conversation we've been having, and it's hard, and I think we mentioned this in a couple of the first information sessions that we held in March. For some communities, the schools that we're talking about, when they were built and opened, operated on a multi-track year-round calendar from day one. Others were converted to multi-track during one of our high growth periods in the early 2000s. And so as a district, way back in the early 2000s, when we started leaning on multi-track year-round as a way to manage rapid growth, when we couldn't keep up on the construction side, but we had so many new students and families coming into the district, the multi-track year-round didn't require any additional facility costs, so it was a more cost-effective approach. At the time, 20 some years ago, I don't think there was an intention that we would lean on multi-track year-round forever to manage our growth and crowding concerns. I think there was an assumption that as we didn't need it, we would sort of fall back to traditional. However, so many of our families have fallen in love with the calendar and really appreciate and have come to sort of build their lives and their infrastructure around the calendar, that it's hard for current families to see that it's truly just a growth management tool. It was never intended to be long-term. So yes, as a district, we're having lots of conversations now that we're this far in. Should we be working to get all schools to traditional long-term as a long-range plan, or does multi-track, or at least track 4, now have a place in sort of our community? And I think we're seeing a little bit of both. I mentioned earlier that North Forest Pines and Pleasant Union, instead of converting from multi-track to traditional, went to track 4. So you're seeing the board kind of acknowledge the space that that calendar sort of takes up in terms of choice and market access. So no, there's not a definitive answer on that, but the board is kind of wrestling with it at this time.
Why was track 4 only recommended for Sycamore Creek instead of traditional if our area is not projected to have growth? It seems like the K through 12 alignment is mentioned a lot, and our middle schools are all traditional.
Yeah, that's some specific feedback that we're receiving now. It appeared in the first round of sessions that the stability of keeping a track 4 when you've grown accustomed to a multi-track might be favorable, but we're starting to hear different feedback on that. And so we certainly will take all of that. I mentioned the current thought exchange. We're seeing more and more comments like that maybe perhaps traditional would be better, because then you could have K-12 calendar alignment. I think Pleasant Union would be the nearest school that's a track 4 school to this site, with Briar Creek kind of to the other side of Sycamore being multi-track. So the question becomes, do we need track 4 in the region for just access to year-round, or is it preferred for the community to go ahead and just go traditional so they can have K-12 calendar alignment? So that is a new perspective that's been brought up in this round of engagement. And so we appreciate that question and that perspective.
How will walker safety be addressed with a significant increase in cars on campus?
Great question. We will be continuously, I know our principals work with their safety planning teams continuously to make sure that there are safe walking routes on campus, that if there are walking zones to their schools, that those are safely monitored and managed. And so we'll just make sure that we continue to support our principals and what they need to create those safe walking paths on campuses. But that is a site-based management decision, and because they know their sites the best. And then they sometimes will partner with their local public safety officers to help develop those plans as well. But the district will support the schools in whatever they need to make sure that those plans are in place, and that the staff know how to best support the walkers on their sites and the walkers that come to their sites.
Why has Heritage Middle been considered before Durant Middle? Durant Middle is only around 60% capacity is what the question states.
Yeah. Durant Middle's already operating on a track 4 only model, so we would not gain any operational efficiency by taking it from track 4 to traditional. So kind of to that earlier question, Melissa, about what's the district's perspective on traditional versus year-round, that school kind of sits in the middle because Durant Elementary and Durant Road Middle are both operating currently on track 4, so we're getting the operational efficiency gains. They are on the same campus. They have K-8 calendar alignment. In the future, would it make sense for them to go traditional and sort of walk away from the year-round structure altogether? That's a longer range question, but we wouldn't gain any operational efficiency by converting them from track 4 to traditional. So that's why they're not being discussed for this particular type of solution.
Why were the 3 schools removed from consideration?
So Briar Creek, Morrisville, and Carpenter Elementary were removed because as we continue to talk with communities, that community, I think, wow, let me see if I can find them. You'll notice that they would be without trailers, they'd be overcrowded, and even with trailers, they'd be at or over capacity. And there are schools in the area that are currently capped and have been capped for a number of years. And the community shared that expanding the boundaries of these schools would be preferred, and that's an option, and we do need to try to get the caps off of the schools that are near them. The other complicating factor for them is that they both are aligned to Alston Ridge Middle School, and Alston Ridge Middle School currently operates on a multi-track year-round and is at capacity, so converting it to a single track or traditional is not an option at this time. And then the third element is that Parkside Middle will be opening in this community in a couple of years and further impact some of these feeder pattern alignments and these calendar alignments. So just really thinking this through, it was just a little too early to bring these schools up for a calendar reduction. And so the recommendation from staff at this point would be to explore opportunities to expand their boundaries and then continue to monitor the enrollment in the region as we prepare for the opening of Parkside Middle before any calendar recommendations are specifically made.
How is the feedback from Holly Grove Elementary families being addressed? Those who are stating they want to remain year-round. Is the recommendation for traditional just because they share campus with the middle school, or is there more to it?
Yeah, the Holly Grove Elementary and Holly Grove Middle alignment was important. We heard that loud and clear, which is why the recommendation was to have the calendars be the same and different from the Heritage conversation. There is sufficient capacity in the elementary schools in the region to absorb the growth that's coming. So there wouldn't be a need for Holly Grove Elementary to, let's say, go to track 4 with the possibility of going to multi-track. It will not be needed in this region because there is sufficient capacity in the area, which is a slightly different conversation point from the Heritage side. So since both of them are on the same campus, they're actually on the same campus as Holly Springs High School, and taking into consideration feedback we're hearing from some families that are really looking forward to the K-12 calendar alignment and all of the access issues that we've talked about for after school programming and extracurricular programming. That's where the recommendation came from.
And you just touched on it, but the next question is, how will calendar changes affect after school programs?
So all the after school programs would continue to operate just on the new schedule. And that's part of why we want to make sure we have at least a year before calendar recommendations take effect or calendar changes take effect, to give you as a school community, the principal and the school staff, as well as central services, the opportunity to come together and make sure we have a clear plan for what that implementation path would look like, so that families know what what's going to happen as that year approaches. I do see a handful of people trying to use the raise the hand feature. We won't be using that in this meeting. Just please continue to add your comments or thoughts to the Q&A, and we'll continue to address those as we go through.
There are several questions related to growth in the area of Heritage and how does Wake County Public Schools interface with the planning department for Wake Forest and look at district maps with new developments. How is that data taken into consideration?
Yeah, I think you can see it here. We've not shied away from it. There's clearly growth coming in the Wake Forest region. These larger blue arrows are directly driven from data that we collect from the town or the town manager, and they share with us what the residential development plans are. We do look for the next 10 years. We try not to go too much further out because that's too project. That's too. They haven't even reviewed plans for those types of projects. So we look at and collect data from them. And Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's projects that are completing now that maybe are under construction and completing now. So we have a feel for how many of those units are coming online in the next couple of months. Projects that have been approved and are under construction, as well as projects that are approved and pending construction. And then finally, we also get an insight into pending projects that maybe haven't been fully approved yet, but we know will be coming in the future. And so all of that information is taken into consideration, and that's where these projections come from. Did I miss any, Melissa?
I think that covers it, except there was a question kind of related. Do we interface with the planning department, or does Wake County Public Schools interface with the planning department regarding calendar changes specifically?
Not directly, no.
Okay, so next, let's see. In the Northeast area specifically, what % of families and community comments cited difficulty accessing sports and extracurricular opportunities as a concern?
So I'll be candid. Some of that comes from families, and we do see that when the students are in the middle school or the high school. But a lot of that feedback we also collect from staff at the school and just from past experience working with schools in the middle schools. So not all families are coming forward and sharing those concerns, but we have heard those concerns from multiple different sources. So we do hear it directly from families through either these types of sessions or other sessions we've had on other topics, or through our thought exchanges. And again, we also hear that information from some of the staff at the school, as well as from staff at other schools who've had similar experiences when conversions have been made. We have heard a lot from schools that went from multi-track to track 4 and how difficult that was to implement. And again, I think I shared this early on. The athletic director for this district was present at the work session on May 5th. So if you fast forward kind of toward the end of the conversation, he addressed some very key and specific points about how track 4 and multi-track in general can create some challenges for families and for students to be able to access those programs. We do recognize that in some communities, you do a really good job of supporting each other and developing carpools and getting students to their events. It's just that long-term piece as well. And keep in mind, that's just one element. The other element is we've heard, loud and clear from a lot of families throughout the entire district over the last several years that calendar mismatches are really not preferred, and that if they can have K-12 calendar alignment, they really prefer to have that. We also hear that K-8 is okay, and we make the transition in high school. So there is some divided feedback on that, but we do hear a lot about wanting some type of calendar consistency and calendar stability. And we recognize that changing the calendar of a school kind of flies in the face of that, but the goal would be the long-term piece, that once this change is made, that we hold it at this point moving forward.
We're running short on time. We'll maybe take one or two more. There are some comments here and questions related to staff concerns. One comment is paying teachers less shouldn't be how we reduce our budgets, and the reasoning behind changing calendars. Another question, well, I think
and the board is very aware of that particular perspective.
Staffing concerns will be handled also separately. Staff will have opportunities to have their specific questions answered. So let's see, how does moving heritage to traditional or track 4 impact the WCPSS equity plan?
Sure. So by moving to a traditional actually would align more clearly with the equity plan, because it creates more equitable access for students, all students assigned to the school, particularly when we're talking about the after school programs. track 4 or traditional would both align with the equity of academic programming and supports. And so that's where that aligns, because when you have all of your students on the same calendar, then the principal and the staff can do a much better job of distributing resources across all students versus having maybe, I think I've seen in the thought exchange at some schools, you might have one teacher teaching 2 grades. You might have one teacher teaching 2 subjects because they're trying to make the math work with the teacher allotments and the student enrollment in a particular track. So by having all of the students on the same track, it's much easier to move students around, do single subject acceleration. It's easier to provide intervention and support services, even counseling services. So that type of equity goal is achieved either way, with either track 4 or traditional during the school hours.
Well, it is just 7:30 now. Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We hope this session has been informative. We appreciate your open and honest participation, and your input and feedback is vital to this process. The thought exchange will remain open through tonight, May 13th. Susan, it is closing at midnight, correct?
Yes.
We encourage you to continue to post comments, and please remember that is also a meaningful way to share your feedback and participate in the discussion. As a reminder, we're presenting a summary of the recommendations and feedback received to the board at their work session next week on May 19th, with a final vote expected later that evening at the Board of Education's regular meeting. And please continue to monitor your email and the district website for updates. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy your evening. And
Thank you
please
so much.
QR code on the screen
Yes.
for thought exchange.
And please continue to visit the website. There's a lot of questions that were asked tonight that were already addressed on the FAQ page, and we'll take any more questions that maybe we didn't get to tonight, and we'll update that. So please continue looking there for responses to questions that maybe you feel went unanswered tonight. Thank you so much.